When the Red Army attacked along the Eastern Front on January 12, 1945, many German cities were quickly surrounded and isolated. The German High Command responded by declaring them fortress cities, where they basically had to resist to the last man and the last bullet. Many suffered sieges that lasted for months and eventually fell even after Berlin. Next in this program, we will look at the three most famous fortress cities on the Eastern Front in 1945, the cities of Königsberg, Wrocław, and Kustrin. January 25, 1945. On Adolf Hitler's orders, Kustrin was turned into a fortress town, which meant it had to be defended to the last man and the last bullet. The penalty for retreating would be death. It was here, just 70 kilometers from the German capital, that the prelude to the Battle of Berlin would take place. But before we begin the analysis of this forgotten battle, let's briefly put it into context. Since December 1944, Hitler has been repeatedly warned of an impending Soviet offensive on the Vistula front. His response had been to simply ignore them. Finally, the house of cards that represented the German defense on the Vistula, in Guderian's words, collapsed on January 12th when the Russians launched Operation Vistula Oder. With up to 6 large army groups, including Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front, the Red Army swept through the German defenses and began advancing at full speed toward the Oder River near Berlin. One of the desperate measures taken by the German leader was the appointment of Himmler as supreme commander of the newly created Army Group Vistula on January 28th. As everything was falling apart in German-occupied Poland, just a few miles away in Kustrin, people were going about their daily routine. The war had claimed most of the men of military age, and those on the streets were mostly children, women, and the elderly. On the radio, German propaganda touted the invincible Eastern Wall, and if anyone doubted that claim, they kept it to themselves. Thus, while the defeats suffered by the German army in Poland were being ignored on the radio and in the news, the first refugees began to arrive in Kustrin. At first, it was just a trickle, but soon it became an avalanche. The first came from the west, fleeing the devastating Allied air raids on major German cities. For most of them, Kustrin was just a stopover on their way to other destinations. Things began to change when the flow reversed and refugees began arriving from the east. The first wave consisted of senior members of the National Socialist Party and their families. They were followed by civilians who used whatever means of transport they could get and brought back disturbing stories of Russian advances and Wehrmacht retreats. Slowly, people began to get nervous, and that feeling grew when the local Volkssturm battalion, composed mainly of teenagers and men who were unfit or too old for military service, was mobilized on January 24th. There was no longer any doubt that something devastating was happening just a few kilometers away from them in an easterly direction. On January 25th, the Führer order declared Kustrin a fortress, with General Adolf Regener as its commander. However, the title Kustrin Fortress was almost ridiculous. The town was home to engineering and artillery units, as well as a few infantry units made up of conscripts or soldiers convalescing from their wounds. The defensive positions were insignificant, as most had been neglected or destroyed in the previous years, and the frozen ground made digging trenches or ditches difficult. Furthermore, it was reported that the Soviets were only about 70 kilometers away and would arrive at any moment. During the last days of January, the garrison of Kustrin Fortress began to grow as a variety of small units began to arrive in the town. The fortress's anti-tank weapons were reinforced by the arrival of a few Panther tank turrets. The turrets, equipped with 75 mm guns, were embedded in strong points along possible avenues of attack. As more units arrived, the defending force became better organized. There were some Luftwaffe members from anti-aircraft units. There was also a battalion made up mainly of Turkmens, as well as another made up mainly of troops from the Caucasus. There were Hitler Youth, the Volkssturm, some Hungarians, and even several members of the Waffen-SS. Some men were individuals who had been separated from their units and had been rounded up by the military police and forced to serve in the garrison. It seemed that this mix of units would be able to do little against the Russians, but General Regener and later SS General Heinz Rheinefarth worked hard to turn them into a real fighting force. While the Germans tried to reinforce their meager defenses, the Soviets continued to advance westward. After taking Warsaw, Zhukov's armies had advanced another 130 kilometers in the period from January 20th to 22. By the 25th, Colonel General Vasily Chuykov's 8th Guards Army, following in the footsteps of the 1st Guards Tank Army, had surrounded the 60,000-man Poznan fortress. Leaving parts of both armies to besiege the city, Zhukov ordered both commanders to continue advancing westward. Zhukov wanted to reach the Oder quickly and establish bridgeheads on the west bank. Rear units would then eliminate German strong points, such as Poznan, and then deploy to consolidate positions on the west bank and prepare for the final advance on Berlin. In his memoirs, he wrote, "Around noon on January 25th, I received a phone call from Stalin. I briefed him on the situation and he asked me about our next moves. I told him that since the enemy was demoralized and could not put up serious resistance, we would continue to advance towards the Oder and try to seize a bridgehead at Kustrin. However, Stalin was worried about Zhukov's right flank. Meanwhile, work continued at Kustrin to strengthen the defenses. The available materials were limited, but as more and more refugees from the east continued to arrive in the town, work intensified as the Russians were known to be getting closer. A major storm that swept through Central Europe on 27 and the 28th of January managed to delay Zhukov's advance somewhat and gave the German defenders an extra day or two. In the last days of January, the weather became warmer and the snow that had fallen during the blizzard began to melt, turning the previously frozen ground into a sticky mass of mud. Zhukov's forces slowed down again, but on the 31st, the forward elements of his front reached the Oder north of Kustrin. The flow of refugees into Kustrin suddenly stopped on the 31st. It was an ominous warning for the garrison. In the early afternoon, a column of Soviet tanks rolled through the village of Druids, just north of Kustrin. They ran over a group of panzer grenadiers assigned to a defensive position and then scattered in search of other targets. A group of a dozen tanks, many of them American Shermans, forced their way through the outskirts of Kustrin and into Neustadt. They continued to advance toward the Wartha bridges, but were stopped by a rush of panicked civilians whose vehicles had created a traffic jam at a major intersection. Finding the road blocked, the Russian armor turned around and looked for another route of access to the river. The German garrison had been completely surprised by the initial penetration, but when the Soviets reached the heart of Neustadt, the alarm was finally raised and tank destroyer teams began to hunt down the Russian armor. Surprisingly, only a few infantrymen accompanied the tanks, and the German forces soon began to eliminate the Soviet attackers with Panzerfausts or sticky bombs. In the end, almost all of the Soviet tanks in the lead were destroyed. Zhukov had reached the Oder, but the Soviet marshal had to face several obstacles. His first task was to establish his bridgeheads on the western bank of the river. Little by little, he was able to establish positions at Kienitz, about 20 kilometers north of Kustrin and south of the city at Göritz. Zhukov had to deal with a shortage of supplies because his fleeting advance had taken him away from his supply depots. In addition, he began to receive reports of a large concentration of German troops on his right flank, which gradually caught his attention. During the march to the Oder, the First Belarusian Front is estimated to have lost 17,000 men and had another 60,300 wounded or sick, representing a loss of 7% of its total personnel. Zhukov thus knew that for the final assault on Berlin, his forces would have to be at full strength. Stalin and the Soviet High Command came to the same conclusion. On February 2nd, Moscow officially declared the Vistula-Oder offensive over. Zhukov was now free to consolidate his positions, but he still had two thorns in his side: the German bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Oder at Kunersdorf near Frankfurt, and the bridgehead at the Kustrin fortress. The appearance of the Soviet vanguard in the center of Kustrin led to an even greater intensification of the fortification of the city, with workdays of up to 18 hours a day. On the western bank of the Oder opposite the city, elements of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division were established. The 25th Division had been shattered in the Soviet summer offensive and had been rebuilt in October. It was joined by the newly formed and understrength 303rd and 309th Infantry Divisions and the personnel of the still-forming Kurmark Division. While some civilians began their exodus from Kustrin westwards towards Berlin, other troops crossed into the city. One of the German officers in Kustrin commented, "It was unpleasant to see the 12 and 13-year-olds who were part of the city's defense. We no longer had any men to fight with and were now using children. Surely the war could not continue much longer." Although the surprise attack by Soviet armored vehicles on the city had failed, the Russians continued to probe the German defenses. By the morning of February 1st, a Soviet unit had succeeded in taking a factory on the northwest edge of the city, annihilating a combined Hungarian Volkssturm force occupying it. Regener was replaced that same day by SS Major General Heinz Reinefarth, despite the objections of the army. Reinefarth's appointment was political, as he had virtually no experience commanding troops in combat. However, Himmler, serving as commander of Army Group Vistula, wanted one of his own to defend the city, and Reinefarth was his choice over an army officer with combat experience. In his memoirs, Guderian commented that Reinefarth was a good policeman, but not a good general. Although the Soviet forces directly involved in the fighting in the Kustrin sector were still relatively weak, Zhukov ordered Chuikov to maintain as much pressure as possible on the garrison. Chuikov thus ordered an attack on the southern sector of the city, which was repulsed with the loss of several tanks. Encouraged by this success, Reinefarth ordered an attack of his own to recapture the Warnik area just east of Kustrin. The attack failed miserably in the face of intense Soviet fire, costing the German general many casualties. On February 3rd, a Russian attack managed to scratch a few yards outside Kustrin, but the Germans managed to hold their ground. The thaw that followed the January blizzard continued to wreak havoc on troop movements. Nevertheless, days later, Zhukov managed to close the supply route on the west bank of the Oder, isolating the Kustrin area. The success was short-lived, as the timely arrival of Colonel Zolenkov's 21st Panzer Division managed to open a narrow corridor that once again provided Kustrin with an escape route to the west. By the end of the first week of February, both sides had settled into a routine. The Soviets fired artillery into the town around noon and constantly mounted nuisance attacks, while the garrison worked to reinforce its defenses between artillery bombardments. General Chuikov gave the following analysis of the situation. The Kustrin citadel was located on an island formed by the Oder and Wartha rivers. During the spring, floods submerged all access to the island, leaving the only links to the citadel in dikes and roads connecting to Berlin, Frankfurt, Posen, and Stettin. The enemy defenders fortified these roads with various defensive structures, such as dugouts, pillboxes, trenches, barbed wire, and minefields. Thus, we could not deploy large forces on these narrow dikes, as passage was limited even for a single armored vehicle. There were approximately 6,800 civilians inside Kustrin, along with some 9,100 Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS personnel and 900 Volkssturm men defending the fortress. There were also an estimated 102 artillery pieces, 30 anti-aircraft guns, 50 mortars, 25 self-propelled guns, and 10 captured Katyusha rocket launchers. As bad weather prevented a major ground attack, the Soviets increased artillery fire and also launched reconnaissance attacks, mostly platoon and company-sized. Rubble from buildings shattered by artillery clogged the streets, and the city's fire department had difficulty extinguishing the flames that seemed to be everywhere. One of the German officers commented that since they were short of ammunition, they could only fire their artillery once for every 20 Soviet shots. The Russians never stopped shelling the small corridor connecting them to Army Group Vistula. In mid-February, the Russians intensified their attacks around Kustrin, hoping to once again cut off the supply corridor to the fortress, but the forces defending the area succeeded in preventing any significant advance. On February 19th, the Germans decided to evacuate some 2,500 civilians from Kustrin. While the evacuations were taking place, the garrison was kept busy repelling Russian attacks on the Kustrin defenses. It should be noted that during these days, Zhukov's attention was focused on repelling Operation Solstice, which the Germans launched against his right flank in Pomerania, and the pressure on Kustrin was relieved. As the Soviets continued their artillery fire in late February, the Hitler Youth boys in Kustrin, who were helping the garrison defenders, were ordered to evacuate the area. Some of them protested, but reluctantly obeyed. Rain lashed the Kustrin sector during the first days of March, making life miserable for both sides. By March 6th, the Soviets launched a major attack on the town. The offensive was directed against Kietz in a surprise attempt to take the suburb. After initial success, the Russians were halted by a desperate counterattack that regained some of the ground lost earlier that day, but left much of the southeastern section of the town in enemy hands. Shortly afterwards, another Soviet attack succeeded in cutting off the corridor, and some 6,000 German defenders were again cut off at Kustrin. The Germans trapped in the fortress were subjected to constant Soviet artillery fire, which gradually reduced them. Finally, by March 12th, the Soviets had succeeded in annihilating most of the German garrison on the east bank of the Oder, after taking almost 3,000 prisoners. While the last German defenders were still at Kustrin, Zhukov was preparing for the assault on Berlin. However, he had to finish taking the city first in order to secure his large bridgehead on the west bank of the Oder. Only the Altstadt sector, which was located on an islet in the middle of the Oder, remained in German hands. The Soviet attacks continued relentlessly over the following days, but they achieved little, and the German corridor was once again left open. On March 22nd, Zhukov launched another major attack with the aim of taking the town of Gorgast and thereby isolating the Germans in Altstadt again. The idea was to form an inner ring midway between Kietz and Gorgast to trap enemy forces within the picket, and an outer ring east of Gorgast to defend against enemy attacks from the outside. Elements of the Doberitz and Müncheberg divisions were in the planned attack zone. After intense fighting in which the Germans claimed to have destroyed 116 Soviet tanks, the outer pincers of the encirclement were closed that afternoon. Fighting continued on the 23rd as the Russians consolidated their newly gained positions. German counterattacks to reconnect the lines were repulsed with considerable losses on both sides over the following days. In the remnants of the Kustrin garrison, casualties increased as Red artillery continued to attack the Old Town and Oder Island. On March 27th, the Germans launched a desperate counterattack to reopen the corridor. Unlike previous efforts, this was to be a coordinated attack. General Theodor Busse, commander of the Ninth Army, had received orders from Berlin to assemble a force that could break through to the Kustrin garrison. Under the nominal command of General Karl Decker, the attacking force consisted of the 20th and 25th Panzer Grenadier Divisions, the Münchenberg Panzer Division, the Führer Grenadier Division, a tank destroyer battalion with 50 Hetzers, and the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion. At 0400 hours, the German forces moved forward and ran into trouble almost immediately. For the previous 3 days, Russian engineers had been busy laying extensive minefields in front of their positions. In the north, the Müncheberg Division headed towards Genschmar. Under heavy Soviet fire, the spearhead reached the outskirts of the town before being repulsed with heavy losses. The central attacking force, consisting of the Führer Grenadier Division and the 20th Panzer Grenadier Division, broke through the Soviet lines and headed towards the German forces trapped on the west bank of the Oder. They too were forced to retreat after coming under heavy artillery fire and a strong Soviet counterattack. In the south, the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division, together with the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion, launched their attack. Their objective was Gorgast, but minefields and strong Soviet defensive positions on the main line stopped them short. Again, this grouping of German forces was blocked by mines and Soviet artillery and could do nothing to reach their objective. Still, a few German Tigers managed to knock out at least 4 Soviet tanks before retreating. The failure of the attack had serious consequences. Hitler was furious, and on the evening of March 28th, he vented his anger on the unfortunate Busse, blaming him personally for the failure. While Hitler berated Busse, General Guderian came to his defense. "Allow me to interrupt you," he told Hitler. Barely controlling his anger, he continued, "Yesterday I explained to you in detail, both verbally and in writing, that General Busse is not to blame for the failure of the attack on Kustrin. The Ninth Army used the ammunition that had been allocated to it. The troops did their duty. The unusually high casualty figures prove this. I therefore ask you not to make any accusations against General Busse." After the explosion, Hitler ordered the room to be cleared. Only Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Guderian remained there. Hitler then ordered Guderian to take a 6-week convalescent leave. Guderian would never see Hitler again. On the other hand, Kustrin's fate now seemed decided. When the defenders of Kietz, the island and the old town heard the gunfire drifting away to the west, groups of soldiers decided to take matters into their own hands and prepared to escape. The conclusion reached by the trapped German soldiers was that they had no chance of holding their positions and that an escape attempt was preferable to a Soviet prison camp. Apparently, Rainer Farth came to the same conclusion. On March 29th, he asked Berlin for permission to escape. His request was denied, but Rainer Farth had no illusions about what his fate would be if he fell into Soviet hands. He too decided to take the risk and leave Kustrin. In the last hour of March 29th, the breakout began. Having breached the Soviet front line, the garrison forces found themselves in nighttime hand-to-hand combat as they advanced towards the Ninth Army lines. The situation was confusing, and the Germans found themselves under fire not only from the Soviets, but also from their own troops and artillery, who had no idea that a breakthrough was taking place. Aided by surprise, darkness, and intermittent rain, the survivors of Kustrin began trickling towards the Ninth Army line at dawn. Later, Ninth Army headquarters reported that 32 officers and 956 non-commissioned officers and soldiers had managed to break through. Other smaller groups continued to reach the German lines over the next few days. According to a Wehrmacht report, the attempt cost the lives of 627 men and wounded 2,359. Finally, on March 31st, the fortress of Kustrin fell into Russian hands. Zhukov had already taken his springboard to Berlin. The survivors of the breakout were now in a kind of limbo. They were isolated and interrogated, not knowing whether they would be shot or hanged for disobeying an order from the Führer or simply letting go. However, Germany was collapsing, and they were eventually sent to other makeshift units that were being formed to stop the impending offensive that Zhukov would launch again. After the war, the German territory east of the Oder, including the area of Kustrin, was ceded to Poland. Part of the city was rebuilt and is now known as Kostrin. Most of the Altstadt was destroyed and was never rebuilt. The only sound in that area is the eerie whistling of the wind blowing through the skeletal ruins of the shattered houses and buildings, and that is why today it is known as Pompeii on the Oder. January 12th, 1945. The skies over Eastern Europe burn red. In the heart of a brutal winter, 6 massive Soviet army groups surge forward like an unstoppable tide, crashing against the fragile German defensive line along the Vistula River. This isn't just another offensive. It's the beginning of the end. After crushing the German defenders with almost unsettling ease, the First Belarusian Front, under the relentless command of Georgy Zhukov, launches a furious race toward Berlin, slicing through the heart of Poland with surgical precision. But in the north, things are not going as smoothly. There, the Third Belarusian and First Baltic fronts move toward a target that is both symbolic and strategic. Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia, the ancestral fortress of German pride and one of the Reich's most formidable strongholds. The East Prussian offensive was far from a mere symbolic gesture. For the Soviet High Command, it was a vital tactical mission to eliminate any threat to the flanks of the armies driving toward Berlin and to avenge the humiliation of 1941. East Prussia was no ordinary front. It was a living fortress, a hellish labyrinth of bunkers, trenches, minefields, and villages turned into fortresses, scattered across frozen forests and snow-covered hills. There, General Raus's 3rd Panzer Army waited, still capable of striking a deadly blow if left unchecked. And the Soviets knew it. On January 13, 1945, hell erupted. Nearly 1.5 million Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and over 2,000 aircraft, stormed into German territory with a fury that knew no limits. But the German defenders would not yield easily. On the first day, the Red Army advanced barely 1.5 kilometers, fighting meter by meter through 3 interlocking defensive lines. Over the next 5 days, at catastrophic human and material cost, they gained only 20 kilometers. The front had slammed into a wall of steel and fire. Yet the Soviet momentum would not be stopped. On January 24th, Konstantin Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian front swung sharply north in a masterful maneuver, severing all land communications between East Prussia and the rest of Germany, isolating over 500,000 German soldiers. From that moment on, their only hope of survival lay at sea. East Prussia, once the symbol of Prussian might, had become a death trap and the prelude to the inevitable collapse of the Third Reich. On January 25th, the organizational chaos of the German High Command reached its peak. Army Group North, trapped in Courland, was renamed Army Group Courland, while the isolated forces in East Prussia took on the name Army Group North. It was a desperate act, an illusion of control over a front already crumbling into ruin. The German troops were soon crushed into 3 deadly pockets by the relentless Soviet onslaught. One around Königsberg, another on the Sambia Peninsula, and a third along the southwestern shore of the Vistula Lagoon, known as the Heiligenbeil Pocket. There, the 3rd Panzer Army and nearly 300,000 civilians were trapped. Inside the city, conditions quickly turned apocalyptic. Supplies vanished. Rations fell to 180 grams of bread per day. The civilians faced 3 equally horrific choices. First, stay and starve to death. Second, cross the front lines and risk capture, or worse. And third, brave the treacherous ice of the Vistula Lagoon toward Pillau, praying to find space aboard an evacuation ship. Thousands chose the third option. Every day, nearly 2,000 women and children marched across the ice, freezing, starving, whispering prayers for survival. Meanwhile, Gauleiter Erich Koch, after returning from Berlin, chose to remain safely in Pillau to organize the evacuation, abandoning those trapped in Königsberg to their fate. On January 28th, the first evacuation ship departed the harbor with 1,800 civilians and 1,200 wounded, reaching safety. But hope was short-lived. It was during this same desperate evacuation that the Wilhelm Gustloff sank, taking with it the lives of more than 9,000 people, one of the greatest maritime tragedies in history. The next day, January 29th, the Red Army launched a massive assault and captured Metgethen, the last land corridor to Pillau. Königsberg was once again completely cut off, this time with no escape. February 1945, a month of carnage. February was a month of pure carnage. German troops fought desperately to maintain a narrow strip of land connecting them to the Sambia Peninsula. More than once, Soviet forces completely sealed off the city, turning it into an open-air tomb. On February 19th, the shattered remnants of the 3rd Panzer Army launched a counterattack from Pillau, led by a captured Soviet T-34 tank. Their mission: reconnect Königsberg with Sambia, reopen the flow of supplies from the sea, and evacuate the trapped civilians. After brutal, close-quarters fighting, they succeeded. A corridor was opened. The Kriegsmarine could once again send provisions to Pillau, and from there to the capital. But it was only a brief respite before the final storm. March, the calm before the end. By March, the front had stabilized. While the rest of Europe burned and Berlin neared collapse, the capture of Königsberg had lost its strategic urgency for the Soviets. Yet the German garrison, deeply entrenched, refused to surrender. Frustrated by the prolonged siege, the Soviet High Command made a final decision. Königsberg must fall by storm. The city was defended by 5 German divisions and thousands of Volkssturm militia, a total of 130,000 men. It was protected by an 1888-era fortress system, 15 forts linked by tunnels, surrounded by 3 concentric defensive rings, making it nearly impregnable. The Germans still maintained a land connection with Sambia, through which supplies arrived. For the Soviets, cutting that link was vital. April 6, 1945, the final assault, begins after 4 days of hellish bombardment. On April 6, 1945, the final assault began. The Soviets attacked from multiple directions with one goal: to shatter the German defense into isolated sectors and crush them one by one. The attack unfolded along 2 main axes. North, the 39th and 43rd Armies. South, the 11th Guards Army. Meanwhile, the 50th Army held the northeast. At dawn, a 3-hour artillery barrage obliterated the German front lines. Soviet rifle divisions advanced rapidly, reaching the 2nd defensive line before noon. But there, the resistance turned savage. Soviet reserves had to be thrown into bloody close-range combat. One of the fiercest battles raged around Fort 8, a modernized stronghold surrounded by a deep moat. Despite relentless artillery fire, the defenders held out all day. Only at dusk did Soviet troops reach the moat and place explosive charges to blast their way in. In the north, progress was equally intense, but slowed by counterattacks from the Samland Group. Fort 5, the strongest of all, halted the Soviet advance until commanders decided to bypass it and concentrate elsewhere. By nightfall, the battle had reached a stalemate. Both sides regrouped in the dark. Though the Soviet advance had been slower than expected, the German defenses were shattered and morale was beginning to crack, even among officers. Bad weather limited air support, but the ground gained allowed preparations for the street-to-street fighting everyone feared. April 7th, the storm breaks. During the night, the Germans launched multiple counterattacks with their last reserves. Every one of them was repelled with ferocity. The Samland Group tried 12 times to break through the lines and failed 12 times. When the weather cleared, Soviet air power was unleashed. Hundreds of bombers, supported by the Baltic Fleet, reduced central Königsberg to rubble. Fort 8, now a near-mythical fortress, fell after an assault of smoke, flamethrowers, and hand-to-hand combat. Its defenders finally surrendered. In the south, the 11th Guards Army advanced to the Pregel River, smashing defenses and seizing the vital central railway station. In the north, Fort 5 was taken after combat engineers set explosives in its walls. The fighting inside raged all through the night. By evening, the situation was desperate. General Otto Lasch, commander of the garrison, requested permission from Hitler to surrender. The answer was unequivocal: fight to the last man. April 8th, the end on April 8th, the 11th Guards Army crossed the Pregel under heavy fire and established a bridgehead. Advancing northward, they linked up with the northern forces, completing the encirclement of Königsberg and isolating the Samland Group entirely. That same day, Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky offered the Germans one last chance to surrender. They refused and launched one final counterattack from the city and from Samland. It was annihilated within minutes by Soviet ground attack aircraft, whose precision and power proved decisive. By the end of the day, the fate of Königsberg was sealed. 40,000 men still held out in the city center, battered by relentless bombardment with no hope left. On April 9, 1945, the German defense finally collapsed. Disorganized and suffering catastrophic losses, General Otto Lasch realized that further resistance was futile. Defying Hitler's direct orders, he sent envoys to negotiate surrender. Shortly before midnight, Königsberg capitulated. The consequences were apocalyptic. 80% of the city lay in ruins. Of the 130,000 defenders, 50,000 were killed or wounded, and 80,000 were taken prisoner. The Red Army never disclosed its casualties, but they are believed to have been extremely high. In Moscow, the victory was celebrated with 324 artillery guns firing in salute and the creation of the medal for the capture of Königsberg. Nearly 100 Soviet military units were granted the honorary title Königsberg. Weeks later, on April 25th, the last German forces on the Samland Peninsula were wiped out, and thus ended the story of German East Prussia. After the war, the northern part of the region was annexed by the Soviet Union. Königsberg was renamed Kaliningrad and repopulated with Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian settlers. Today, following the dissolution of the USSR, it remains the Kaliningrad Oblast, a Russian enclave between Poland and Lithuania, a silent witness to one of the most brutal battles of the Second World War.
January 12, 1945. The Red Army has begun its great offensive on the Vistula front and will not stop until it is only 70 kilometers from Berlin, at the beginning of February. During this totally devastating attack, all the German armies defending Poland have been practically annihilated. However, in the midst of so much chaos, hardship, and devastation, there was a German city that resisted isolated in the middle of the Soviet rear for almost 3 months, until the end of the war. This one that we are going to see next is known as the Siege of Wrocław, which is one of the greatest examples of Hitler's famous fortress cities, where the Volkssturm also stood out in combat. Thus, this battle for Wrocław has all the ingredients that define the agonizing fall of the Third Reich during its last months of combat. It all started in August 1944, when the Soviets were stopped at the gates of Warsaw, and the new front was stabilized in the vicinity of the Vistula River. This that we are seeing on the map was the maximum advance of the Red Army during Operation Bagration that they launched that summer. Despite the fact that the city of Wrocław was some 270 kilometers from the new front line, the German leader gave orders to begin work on defensive structures to fortify the city. Although the exact date on which the Red Army would attack again was not known, it was better to be prepared, and most of the important cities that were in the German rear were declared fortress cities. As we have analyzed in other programs, the objective of a fortress city is to delay the advance of the enemy army as much as possible. This is achieved in the first place by occupying them with a fundamental axis of terrestrial communications, which hinders their logistics system, and secondly, forcing their vanguards to stop before this new obstacle and thus stop advancing. With this, it is possible to slow down or stop the enemy advance, which gives time to establish a new defensive line. While this strategy may look effective on paper, in reality it proved disastrous, leading to hundreds of thousands of soldiers being stranded in the Soviet rear, without having much impact on the pace of the Allied advance. Thus, and given the fear of the German soldiers of being isolated and being captured, on most occasions these orders were not complied with, and the different commanders gave the order to abandon said cities when they found themselves overwhelmed by the Red Army. However, this would not happen in Wrocław. The strategic importance of this city was very high because it was the main axis of the Silesia region, in which there were important German industrial complexes. In addition, it protected the entrance to the north of Czechoslovakia and made the interior of Germany in the direction of Dresden. At the end of 1944, it is estimated that the population of Wrocław amounted to about 625,000 inhabitants, which did not stop increasing during the final months of 1944 and the beginning of 1945, with all the wave of refugees that occurred before the advance of the Red Army. When the Soviet breakout occurred on the Vistula front, the city began to receive many people who had to flee, and also soldiers who retreated at full speed to the west. It was approximately on January 22nd, when the first Ukrainian front Ivan Konev reached the vicinity of Wrocław. This group of armies formed part of the southern flank of the Great Soviet Offensive, whose center was formed by Zhukov's First Belarusian Front. It was precisely in the center where the greatest advance took place, leaving part of both the Silesian and Pomeranian regions unconquered. In any case, before this advance, a day before on January 21st, the order was given to evacuate the largest number of civilians from Wrocław, and at least 700,000 civilians had to start a very hard march in the direction of Dresden, with freezing temperatures. 20 degrees below zero. It is estimated that 80,000 of them died during the journey. On the other hand, in Wrocław there was a garrison of about 50,000 combatants, being 35,000 Wehrmacht soldiers and 15,000 Volkssturm militiamen. In addition to these 50,000 combatants, a little over 100,000 civilians stayed in the city, increasing the garrison's demand for food. One of the biggest fears that the Volkssturm had since its formation was that they would not be recognized as regular soldiers by the enemy, and would be considered partisans. This would lead to their immediate execution once captured. Another of their problems was the poor weapons with which they were equipped and their poor training. Thus, due to the advanced age of its members, its precarious material and low mobility, the Volkssturm battalions had a reduced combat value, which made no difference in practically any sector of the front. However, here in Wrocław, it would not be like that. One of the main objectives that both Konev and Zhukov had at this time was to reach the Oder River and cross it, to continue advancing towards Berlin, or at least to be able to establish bridgeheads on the western bank. This is something that both the First Ukrainian and Belarusian fronts were able to do during the last days of January, although for this Konev had to leave Wrocław behind. It was a few days later, specifically on January 31st, when the Soviet Marshal fixed his gaze on the southern flank and ordered his Sixth Army to conquer the city of Wrocław. Taking this city would allow him to seize the main axis of the region's highways, and would allow him to improve his logistics system, so he could advance at a higher speed. Konev thought that the taking of Wrocław was going to be something routine that was not going to cause greater difficulties than any other city taken previously, and he gave a margin of 4 days for its conquest. The attack was able to begin on February 8th, after a few days of delay due to the collapse of the Soviet logistics system after the frenzied advance, and they needed a few days to gather the necessary troops to take Wrocław. This first phase of attack lasted from February 8th to 16th, the day the city was completely surrounded. During this final stage, the Soviets found that the German defenses around Wrocław were very strong, and they had no choice but to surround the city. Although they had planned to take this position in just 4 days, this hard German resistance made their plans fail. The Germans made an attempt to keep a corridor open, with the aim of continuing to evacuate civilians from Wrocław, but it was closed on the 16th, as we have just said. So from this moment, the siege of Wrocław began. It should be noted that the Wrocław flanking operation was not easy for the Soviets, since they did not fight against a static enemy that was defending itself desperately. To tell the truth, the Germans were able to counterattack on several occasions and achieved small victories against the Soviet vanguards. As is logical and natural, this extreme resistance in Wrocław began to capture all the eyes of Minister Goebbels, who set it as an example to follow in all German cities. After the first 10 days of combat, the Soviet general of the Sixth Army Gluzdovsky realized that his accelerated assault on Wrocław had failed, and once the city was surrounded, he began to prepare a better coordinated attack against it. The new attack he was preparing consisted of a powerful attack from the south, to be joined by 2 others to the north and northwest of the city. For this, the Soviet general needed to reorganize his forces and accumulate all kinds of material. On the other hand, the Germans wasted no time, and throughout this month of February they sent an elite parachute regiment that reinforced the defenses of Wrocław and established an airlift that was able to supply the troops surrounded in the city that were estimated to be about 50,000 fighters of all kinds. The new Soviet attack began on February 22nd and 23rd, supported by strong artillery attacks that little by little destroyed most of the city. Regarding the ground attack, it did not achieve any significant penetration, and after a few days it had to be suspended. The German defenses remained solid. Another Soviet assault took place on March 6th, preceded by an air raid by more than 1,000 bombers that again mercilessly smashed the German defenses. However, again the ground assault was repulsed after losing more than 100 tanks. It should be noted that at this time there were units in which 12 and 13-year-old children were fighting, wreaking havoc with their Panzerfausts. Of course, if the Germans could defend the Oder front with such tenacity, Goebbels claimed that victory was certain. By early March, in addition to launching this failed assault on Wrocław, the Soviets attacked Pomerania and consolidated their entire right flank. From here, they began to accumulate troops and material for their final assault on Berlin. Meanwhile, Wrocław had been isolated some 130 kilometers from the new German defensive line on the Nysa River. After the failure of this assault on the city at the beginning of March, the Red Army organized another for April 1st. Again this time they began their attack with a massive artillery attack that ended up destroying 80% of the buildings in the city. After the bombardment, the Soviet armored brigades charged, and this time, they managed to penetrate the German defenses. One of the main achievements of this attack was to seize the German airfield, through which the Germans received their supplies and reinforcements. In addition, the defensive perimeter of Wrocław was greatly reduced, and it was now that of the city itself. However, the Germans were able to contain the Red Army assault, and again destroyed numerous Soviet armored vehicles. Thus, by the beginning of April, the city continued to resist despite being completely isolated and without any possibility of rescue. Needless to say, at this time all German propaganda actions were focused on this heroic resistance. During that month of April, the situation in Wrocław became even more critical, and food and ammunition became increasingly scarce. Morale was also getting lower every day, and the hell that the soldiers lived there being bombed practically every day began to be unbearable. Luckily for them, once the new Soviet offensive began on the Oder front, there was no major activity in Wrocław. When they learned of Hitler's death on May 1st, the Wrocław military commanders understood that their resistance no longer made sense, since negotiations to sign peace were already taking place. Thus, General Hermann Niehoff began a negotiation on his behalf with the Soviet General Gluzdovsky to surrender his garrison with the promise of receiving good treatment for prisoners and civilians. This led to the fact that on May 6 the 20,000 soldiers that remained in Wrocław ended up surrendering, just a few hours before the official surrender of Germany. During these almost 3 months of combat, the Germans had a total of 29,000 casualties, with 6,000 dead and 23,000 wounded, to which must be added the 20,000 soldiers who were finally captured. On the other hand, the Red Army suffered 60,000 casualties, with 13,000 dead and 47,000 wounded, to which must be added the loss of 125 tanks.